order came just before dawn. Remove your clothes, 3 words, spoken in English by a voice so calm it barely rose above the sound of the sea. 3 words that made 200 Japanese women freeze in the half-light of Manila's port like deer, sensing the hunter's approach. Keiko Yamada was 25 years old and already exhausted from being afraid. 4 days of marching through mud that sucked at their boots. 4 days of rumors whispered in the dark about what the Americans did to captured women. 4 days knowing that when you surrender to the enemy, you become something less than human. At least that's what the Empire had taught her. The wind carried salt and diesel in the rot of a city that had changed hands too many times. Crates clattered somewhere beyond the barbed wire. A truck backfired and every head flinched. In that instant, silence became unbearable. Keiko stood in the second row of the formation. Her Imperial Army nurse's uniform was stiff with sweat and ash from the march. Around her, women stared at the ground or at the sky or at nothing at all, waiting for someone else to move first, waiting for the moment to pass, waiting for anything except what was coming. The guard repeated the command, not louder, slower, like he was reciting instructions for a medical procedure he didn't believe would work. Remove your clothes. Keiko's hands moved to the first button of her tunic before her mind caught up. Muscle memory from years of following orders. From a lifetime of being told that obedience was the highest virtue. That questioning was weakness. That to resist was to bring dishonor not just on yourself, but on everyone who shared your blood. Her fingers trembled so violently she had to hide them behind her back. She remembered what her commanding officer had said 3 weeks before Manila fell. Death before dishonor. Surrender is worse than dying. The Americans will do things to you that no decent woman should survive. Those words had felt like armor then. Now they were just weight. The sun hadn't cleared the horizon yet, but its reflection shimmered on the water like a blade being sharpened. The guards stood motionless, boots sinking slightly into sand rifles hanging loose but ready. Not aimed, not threatening, just present, like furniture that happened to be armed. Keiko's heartbeat became the loudest sound in her universe. Every other noise magnified into significance. The clicking of metal buckles, distant seagulls, the hum of a generator powering lights that hadn't been turned off yet because dawn was still negotiating with darkness. Fear had its own rhythm. She was learning to hear it. Then a second voice broke through the tension. Younger. British accent, not American. Almost apologetic in its tone. You will be inspected for lice and infection. Standard medical procedure. No harm will come to you. The words landed like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of confusion that spread through the formation. Medical procedure. No harm. The phrases didn't fit. They belonged to a different story than the one Keiko had been preparing herself for. The story where captured women were violated and humiliated and disposed of like trash. The story that Japanese propaganda had drilled into every soldier until it became more real than memory. But this voice was explaining itself, almost asking permission. Compassion didn't belong here. Not in this place where 200 women stood waiting to discover what kind of mercy their captors believed in. For several seconds, nothing happened. Dust clung to their ankles. Sweat rolled down spines that had been held rigid for so long, they might never remember how to curve. The ocean breathed in the distance like it had been doing for 1,000,000 years and would continue doing long after everyone here was dust. Then Keiko took one step forward. Not from courage, from something closer to surrender within surrender. A final exhaustion that made waiting worse than whatever came next. She unbuttoned the first clasp of her tunic with hands that wouldn't fully obey. The fabric stuck to her skin from days of wear. Another woman followed her lead, then another, until the sound of cloth shifting replaced the wind. None of the guards moved. They simply waited. One of them, a corporal with sunburned cheeks and freckles that made him look younger than he probably was, looked away and swallowed hard. The motion was visible, even from 15 feet away. His discomfort clear as daylight. In that brief glance, Keiko saw something she hadn't expected. Shame. Not cruelty, not hunger, not the cold assessment of a predator choosing prey. Just shame. The kind that comes from being forced to witness something that makes you feel small inside your own skin. It startled her more than any gun could have. More than shouting, more than violence. Because shame meant he saw her as human enough to feel uncomfortable around. Shame meant he recognized this moment as something that shouldn't be happening, even though regulations said it must. The fear didn't vanish, but something shifted. A crack opening in the wall of hatred that war had built between them. When the first piece of fabric hit the sound was soft, almost gentle. A gull cried overhead, unconcerned with human drama. Somewhere behind them, a kettle whistled from a field kitchen where breakfast was being prepared. The world continued as if this moment were too small to notice. But for these women, time had stopped. They were no longer soldiers, no longer prisoners, just humans waiting to learn what kind of mercy existed in a world where mercy wasn't guaranteed by anything except the thin protection of international law that most of them had never heard of. Then one of the guards stepped forward, not with rope, not with a weapon, but with a folded white towel held in both hands like an offering. The cotton was clean. It smelled faintly of soap and starch. The guard extended it toward Keiko without meeting her eyes. "Take this," he said. His voice was rough. Midwestern accent, maybe Iowa or Nebraska. Places Keiko had only read about in geography books before the war made geography into a weapon. She stared at the towel, at the impossible kindness of clean fabric in a world that had stopped making sense. Her hands remained frozen at her sides. The guard, a sergeant based on the stripes she could see, kept his arms extended, patient, like he had all the time in the world. Like this was normal procedure and not the moment when everything Keiko believed about enemies and mercy and the nature of war itself was being rewritten in real time. She took the towel. The fabric was coarse but clean. It felt like it had been washed 100 times and would be washed 100 more. Standard issue. Mass-produced. Part of a system so large it could afford to give clean towels to prisoners who had every reason to expect nothing except cruelty. Behind her, other women were receiving their own towels. The guards moved with mechanical efficiency. No commentary, no judgment, just the routine execution of a protocol that said prisoners deserve basic dignity even when nothing else about war suggested dignity still existed. Keiko clutched the towel against her chest. The weight of it felt enormous, heavier than any weapon she'd ever carried. Because weapons made sense in war. Towels didn't. Clean fabric given freely to enemies made no sense at all, unless mercy was real and systematic and applied without regard for who deserved it. The sergeant gestured toward a row of khaki tents behind the dock. White smoke rose from tin kettles. The smell of disinfectant cut through the salt air. "Step forward one at a time," he said. His voice was tired. Like he'd done this many times before, and would do it many times again. Like processing prisoners with basic decency was just another task on an endless list of tasks that war generated with industrial efficiency. Take the towel, proceed to the medical tent. The words were simple, the grammar basic, but the tone carried something Keiko recognized from her own nursing training. The voice of someone trying to maintain order, not through fear, but through the stubborn insistence that procedures existed for good reasons. The line began to move. Women shuffled forward, holding their towels like talismans. The guards stood apart, forming a path but not blocking it. There were no shouts, no blows, no threats. Only the steady rhythm of breathing and shuffling feet and the distant hiss of boiling water. Keiko walked toward the tent, her mind racing faster than her feet could carry her. Every step felt like moving through a dream where the rules kept changing, where the enemy behaved like something other than what 5 years of propaganda had promised. Inside the tent, light changed. Sunlight filtered through canvas, turning everything golden. Warm, almost gentle. Keiko had expected interrogation. Maybe cameras to document their humiliation. Maybe cold water and rough handling and all the small cruelties that added up to the systematic destruction of dignity. Instead, there were tables, metal basins filled with steaming water, brushes arranged in neat rows, bottles marked with red crosses. The sharp, clean smell of antiseptic that reminded her of hospitals before the war turned them into places where people went to die slowly instead of quickly. A woman in a medical uniform stood at the far end. British or American, Keiko couldn't tell. Her sleeves were rolled up, hair tucked under a white cap. She looked too young to be here. Maybe 30. Definitely too young to have eyes that old. The woman glanced at the prisoners filing in, but her gaze didn't linger. Didn't assess them as enemies or threats or objects of curiosity. She looked at them the way Keiko had been trained to look at patients. as bodies that needed care, as problems requiring solutions, as humans temporarily reduced to their medical requirements. The woman spoke quietly to another medic who handed her a clipboard. They worked with the detached focus of people who'd done this 100 times. Who knew that compassion was easier when you didn't think too hard about who you were being compassionate toward? Keiko watched as the first prisoner stepped up to a basin. The medical officer dipped a cloth into the water and began washing the woman's arms. Methodically, efficiently, without commentary or emotion. Steam rose from the basin. The prisoner flinched but didn't resist. When the medical officer handed her a dry towel, their eyes met for half a second. Something passed between them. An understanding too complicated for language, too private for witnesses. The officer nodded once, small, almost imperceptible, then moved on to prepare for the next prisoner. Keiko's turn came quickly, too quickly. She stepped forward on legs that felt unreliable, stood before the basin holding her towel against her chest like armor that might protect her from kindness she didn't know how to accept. The medical officer gestured for her to lower the towel. Her hands were clean, nails trimmed short, professional. The hands of someone who took her job seriously even when her job involved caring for people her country was at war with. The water was warm, not scalding, not cold, just warm, comfortable. The temperature you'd choose if you had a choice, if comfort mattered at all in a place like this. As the cloth touched her skin, Keiko felt her body react, not with fear, with confusion. The motion was so deliberate, so careful, it felt almost like respect. Like her body deserved to be treated gently even though everything about this situation said otherwise. No one had touched her like that since the war began. Not with care, not with attention to whether the water was the right temperature, or the cloth too rough, or the soap too harsh. The medical officer worked in silence, checking for lice, looking for signs of infection or disease that might spread through the camp. Standard procedure, standard care, applied to enemies as if enmity didn't matter when weighed against basic medical protocol. When the inspection finished, the officer stepped back and motioned toward a pile of folded clothing on a nearby table. Clean uniform, she said. Simple statement, no ceremony. Just information delivered in the flat tone of someone who dealt in facts rather than feelings. The words reached Keiko's ears like music from another world. Clean clothing, given freely, to prisoners, to enemies, to people who by all rights should be grateful for whatever scraps they received. Keiko approached the table with hands that still trembled. The uniforms were white, cotton, recently washed and pressed. On the chest of each one, black letters had been stenciled in a blocky military font. PW. She didn't know what the letters meant. Prisoner of war, maybe? Or some designation in English that marked her as belonging to a new category she hadn't known existed until this moment. She picked up one of the uniforms. The fabric was soft, still warm from being dried in the sun. The stitching was perfect, machine-made, industrial, every seam identical, every button aligned. The kind of precision that came from mass production, from systems designed to manufacture clothing at a scale that individual tailors couldn't match. These uniforms had been made before she arrived, before she surrendered, before she even knew she would become a prisoner. Someone had anticipated the need, had ordered the production, had ensured that when prisoners arrived there would be clean clothing waiting. The enemy had prepared to be merciful. That realization settled into Keiko's stomach like cold stone, because it meant this wasn't improvisation. This wasn't individual kindness from a sympathetic guard. This was system, organization, the machinery of mercy operating with the same efficiency as the machinery of war. She clutched the uniform and felt the weight of it. Not physical weight, the weight of implication, of understanding that the enemy was powerful enough to treat prisoners well, not because they wanted to, but because their systems demanded it. Because regulations existed that said even enemies deserve basic dignity, and those regulations would be followed with the same rigid discipline as every other military requirement. She dressed slowly. The cloth was too big, but clean. When she tied the belt, the letters on her chest became visible. PW. Whatever it meant, she was one now, had been transformed from enemy combatant to something else by the simple act of being clothed in uniform white. Outside, the sergeant from earlier stood waiting. He looked at the emerging prisoners with a face that seemed uncertain what expression was appropriate. Relief, maybe, or exhaustion, or the complicated mix of both that comes from doing something difficult that you know is right, even when right doesn't feel satisfying. "You'll be issued food soon," he said. His voice was flat. "Medical check in 2 hours." Then he stepped aside and let them pass. The women filed past him in silence, unsure whether to feel relief or humiliation, unsure what emotion fit a situation where you'd been prepared for the worst and received something that looked almost like care instead. Keiko glanced back at the medical tent as she walked, at the steam still rising from basins, at the guards who'd looked away, at the system that had processed them with clinical efficiency and basic human decency. She understood now why no one had shouted, why everything had moved like clockwork. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even kindness in the way she understood kindness. It was procedure, protocol, the systematic application of rules that said prisoners deserve certain treatment and would receive it whether individual guards felt generous or not. And somehow that made it more powerful, more real, because it meant mercy wasn't dependent on good people making good choices. It was built into the structure itself, required by regulation, enforced by discipline. The Americans didn't need to show emotion. Their order itself was mercy. When the sun reached its peak, the camp shimmered with heat. The white towels hung over railings, drying in the breeze. From a distance, they could have been mistaken for flags of surrender, or maybe flags of something else entirely. Something that didn't have a name yet because the war hadn't taught anyone the vocabulary for organized compassion delivered without sentiment. Keiko sat by the fence, her body still trembling from exhaustion and confusion. The same towel that had been a symbol of surrender now felt like proof that civilization hadn't died completely. That somewhere in the machinery of war, someone had remembered that people were still people, regardless of what side they fought for. That night, she lay awake in the barracks assigned to female prisoners. The cot was narrow but had a mattress. The blanket was thin but clean. Above her, canvas stretched across wooden frames, creating a ceiling that kept out rain but not sound. She could hear other women breathing, some crying softly, some whispering prayers to gods who hadn't prevented any of this but might still be listening, some just lying silent, processing the day's strange mercy. Her body ached from the march, from 4 days of fear, from the whiplash of expecting violation and receiving something that looked almost like dignity instead. She realized no one had spoken the entire day. Not the guards, not most of the prisoners. Silence had become their common language, the only vocabulary that fit a situation too complicated for words. In that silence, something fragile was being built. Not trust, not forgiveness, just the smallest, most dangerous seed of all. Understanding, the recognition that enemies might be human too, that mercy could exist within systems, that war hadn't destroyed everything worth preserving. Keiko reached under her thin mattress where she'd hidden something during the confusion of arrival. A photograph, creased and faded. The Golden Gate Bridge spanning water so blue it looked painted. San Francisco, 1939. A lifetime ago in a world that seemed like fiction now. She'd been born there, had spoken English before Japanese, had dreamed of nursing school at UCSF before everything fell apart, before Pearl Harbor, before Executive Order 9066 made it clear that Japanese blood meant she wasn't really American regardless of where she'd been born. Her parents had panicked, chose deportation over internment, dragged her back to a Japan she'd never known. And then the military had conscripted her. And then Manila had fallen. And then here she was, neither American nor Japanese, neither prisoner nor free, just someone caught between worlds that hated each other. She tucked the photograph back into its hiding place. Some secrets were too dangerous even for allies who might not stay allies. Some identities were too complicated to explain to people who needed enemies to be simple. But the photograph remained, evidence that she'd been someone else before the war, proof that identity was more fluid than propaganda admitted, a reminder that maybe someday she could return to being the person who looked at bridges and saw possibilities instead of barriers. Sleep came slowly. When it finally arrived, she dreamed of bacon, of San Francisco kitchens, of her grandmother's hands making breakfast on Saturday mornings when the world was small and safe, and promised to stay that way. She dreamed of a life before uniforms, before empires, before the machinery of war ground everything beautiful into standardized parts that could be counted and categorized and disposed of when no longer useful. She dreamed of mercy that didn't need to be organized because it came naturally, from love instead of regulation, from choice instead of requirement. But when she woke, she was grateful even for the systematic kind, for the mercy of protocols, for the kindness of rules followed by people who might not feel kind, but who did kind things anyway because discipline demanded it. She was grateful for white towels and warm water and uniforms that fit well enough. She was grateful to be alive in a way that still felt human. And that gratitude, unexpected and uncomfortable and completely unearned, would change everything that came after. The smell arrived before dawn. Bacon. Not the memory of bacon, not the idea of bacon whispered through propaganda or rationed into paper-thin promises. Real bacon. Thick-cut American bacon fat rendering into liquid gold on cast-iron griddles that had seen 1,000 Texas mornings before this one. The scent moved through the Manila camp like a ghost returning from a better world. Keiko woke to it. Her eyes opened in darkness, and for 3 confused seconds, she was 7 years old again. Saturday morning in San Francisco. Her grandmother's kitchen. The radio playing swing music. The promise that breakfast meant safety, that the world was fundamentally good. Then memory returned. The barracks. The white uniform marked with black letters. The war that had just ended but somehow hadn't finished with her yet. The bacon smell remained. Impossible. Undeniable. Beside her cot, Hannah sat up, nostrils flaring. The young nurse's face cycled through confusion, recognition, then something that looked like pain. "Is that?" Hannah whispered in Japanese. "Don't," Yuki hissed from across the aisle. The former teacher's wrist was still bandaged from her suicide attempt 3 nights before. Her voice carried the weight of someone who tried to escape and failed. "Don't acknowledge it. Don't let them see you want it." But want had nothing to do with it anymore. The smell triggered something deeper than hunger. It triggered memory, identity, the ghost of a self that existed before uniforms and empires and the machinery of war ground individual lives into statistical dust. Keiko rose, dressed in her white prisoner uniform, noticed her hands were shaking. Outside, morning light was just beginning to sketch the camp into existence. The mess tent glowed like a paper lantern. Inside, she could hear the percussion of breakfast being prepared. Metal on metal, the sizzle of fat. Men's voices calling orders in English that carried the rhythms of Texas, of Iowa, of places that existed in a different universe than the one she'd inhabited for 5 years. The women formed a line without being told. Military discipline was a muscle memory that outlived armies. The mess tent opened. Corporal Jimmy Rodriguez, Texas they called him, stood behind a griddle the size of a door. His face was round and young and permanently sunburned. He wore an apron that said, "Kiss the cook," in fading letters, a joke from some previous life that had followed him to war. He grinned when he saw them. Not mockery, something closer to pride. "Morning, ladies," he said in English, then repeated it in broken Japanese. "Good morning, today special. Today, real American breakfast." Beside him, Sergeant Morrison stood at attention, wooden and uncomfortable. He wouldn't meet Keiko's eyes. Hadn't since the night he'd found her letter. Since the night he'd learned she was something other than what the war required her to be. "Everyone gets 2 servings, Morrison announced. His voice was flat. Official. "Rules." That word again. Rules, not mercy, not kindness, not even basic human decency, just rules. The protocol of civilization applied without exception or emotion. Keiko stepped forward, accepted the tin tray that Texas handed her, watched as he loaded it with an efficiency that suggested he'd done this 10,000 times before. 4 strips of bacon, crispy at the edges, still glistening with fat. Scrambled eggs, bright yellow, fluffy, real eggs from real chickens who lived real lives. 2 slices of white bread, toasted, buttered. So white it looked like something from a dream, and something she didn't recognize. Shredded potatoes, fried golden, seasoned with salt and pepper. Hash browns, Texas said, noticing her confusion. He mimed eating. "Very good, very American." The tray weighed almost nothing. The food weighed everything. Keiko carried it to a table, sat, stared at the meal like it might vanish if she looked away. Around her, other women were experiencing the same paralysis. 200 prisoners, 200 trays, 200 individual confrontations with the reality that their enemy had just fed them better than their own empire ever had. Some cried silently, some sat frozen. One older woman, Tomoko, who'd been a radio operator, picked up a piece of toast and simply held it to her face, inhaling, breathing in the smell of wheat and butter and the mechanical abundance of American agriculture. Yuki refused her tray entirely. She sat rigid at the end of the table, arms crossed, watching the others betray their principles with every bite. Her bandaged wrist rested on the table like an accusation. But even Yuki's hands trembled. Keiko lifted a strip of bacon. The grease marked her fingers. She brought it to her mouth. Bit down. The universe collapsed into a single point of sensation. Salt, smoke, fat, comfort. The taste exploded across her tongue and rewrote 5 years of war in a single second. Suddenly she was in her grandmother's kitchen. The sun was coming through lace curtains. The radio was playing Benny Goodman. Her mother was laughing at something her father said. The world was small and safe and promised to stay that way forever. The tears came before she could stop them. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to hold everything in. The bacon, the memory, the sudden overwhelming grief for a version of herself that the war had killed more thoroughly than any bullet. She'd been American once, before her parents panicked, before Executive Order 9066, before the choice between internment camps and a return to a Japan she'd never known. Before the war taught her that identity was just another kind of uniform you wore until someone told you to take it off. The bacon tasted like coming home to a house that no longer existed. Around her, the cascade was happening. The elderly woman was crying into her toast. Hana had her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. Even some of the harder women, the ones who'd maintained military bearing through surrender and captivity and the systematic dismantling of everything they'd been taught to believe, even they were breaking. Food had become memory. Memory had become grief. Grief had become recognition. They were human. They had been human all along. The war had just made them forget. Morrison watched from the serving line. His face was carefully blank, but Keiko saw the way his jaw worked, the way he gripped the serving spoon too tight. He was seeing something he hadn't expected to see. He was seeing the enemy cry over bacon. Texas noticed it too. The big corporal's grin had faded. He ladled eggs onto another tray, but his movements had slowed. Become thoughtful. "Sarge," he said quietly to Morrison, "they're just kids, most of them younger than my sister." Morrison said nothing, but his hand moved to his breast pocket, to the place where he kept Keiko's letter. The one that said she could no longer hate. The one that was rewriting the war in both their heads. Keiko forced herself to eat. The eggs were perfect, creamy, seasoned with salt and black pepper. The hash browns were crispy on the outside, soft inside, touched with butter and onions. The toast melted on her tongue. Every bite was an education in abundance, in the casual wealth of a nation that could feed even its prisoners this well, in the systematic generosity of a country that had industrialized mercy the way it had industrialized everything else. She thought about the Imperial Army hospitals where she'd worked, the way supplies were divided by rank. Officers ate meat, soldiers ate rice, prisoners ate nothing. The hierarchy was absolute. Your worth was determined by your position in the machine. Here, every woman received the same tray, the same portions, the same quality. A colonel's daughter and a farmer's daughter ate identical bacon. Equality enforced not by philosophy, but by protocol. The Geneva Convention made flesh. She finished eating. The tin tray was empty. Her stomach was full for the first time in months. But the emptiness inside her had only grown larger, because now she had to ask herself the question she'd been avoiding since the moment a white towel appeared instead of violence. What if everything she'd been taught was wrong? What if the enemy wasn't evil? What if they were just powerful enough to afford kindness? What if mercy wasn't weakness, but the luxury of a nation so confident in its strength that it could follow rules even when hatred would be easier? What if she'd fought for the wrong side? The thought was more terrifying than surrender had ever been. Across the mess tent, Morrison was staring at her. Their eyes met. He looked away first, but not before she saw something in his face that mirrored her own confusion. He'd been taught to hate. The war had demanded it. His brother had died at Guadalcanal, and hatred should have been easy, natural, justified. But hatred required the enemy to be less than human. And he just watched 200 women cry over breakfast. The morning continued. The women returned their trays, filed out of the mess tent, moved through the routines of captivity that had become familiar. Medical checks, laundry, the slow procession of days that belonged to no one. But something had shifted. Yuki still refused to eat, but her refusal was looking less like strength and more like stubbornness. Less like principle and more like pride with nowhere left to stand. That night, Morrison found Keiko by the fence line, the same place they talked before. The same careful distance that allowed plausible deniability if anyone asked. He didn't speak at first, just stood there looking west toward the ocean, toward the war that had officially ended, but lingered in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Finally, you cried. It wasn't a question. Keiko didn't pretend to misunderstand. "The bacon," she said in English. Let him hear the accent that was pure California, pure American, pure proof that she was something the war hadn't prepared either of them for. "It tasted like my grandmother's kitchen, San Francisco, before everything." Morrison was quiet for a long time. "Then my mom used to make bacon on Sundays. After church, the whole house would smell like it. Tommy, my brother, he'd always to try to sneak pieces before breakfast was ready." A pause. "He died thinking your people were monsters. We thought the same about you." Were we both wrong? Keiko considered this. Considered the white towels and the warm water, and the perfect stitching on mass-produced uniforms. Considered the bacon and the rules and the way Morrison's hands shook slightly when he talked about his brother. "I don't know," she said, "but I think maybe the war wanted us to be. Wrong, I mean. Wanted us to be monsters so we'd be easier to kill." Morrison reached into his pocket, pulled out a piece of paper. Not her letter, something new. He'd written on the back of a medical supply label. "Iodine, antiseptic properties." He handed it to her. She unfolded it, read by the last light of sunset. The handwriting was careful, practiced, like he'd written it several times before getting it right. "My brother died hating your people. I wanted to hate you too, but rules made me treat you like a human being long enough to remember that's what you are. Maybe that's what protocols are for, to keep us human when everything else tries to make us monsters." Keiko read it twice, folded it carefully, placed it in her uniform pocket next to the photograph of the Golden Gate Bridge that she'd managed to keep hidden through surrender and captivity in the systematic stripping away of everything that made her who she was. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For remembering." Morrison nodded, started to leave, then turned back. "The war's over," he said, "but we're still here, still following the same rules. Still," he struggled for words, "still trying to figure out what we do when the enemy stops being simple." He walked away before she could respond. Keiko stood by the fence until full dark, thinking about bacon and brothers and the strange mercy of systems that treated people fairly even when fairness wasn't deserved, even when fairness was harder than hatred. She thought about writing another letter, but some things were too complicated for words. Instead, she touched the paper in her pocket. Morrison's confession. His attempt to make sense of a war that had stopped making sense the moment they both realized the enemy was human. Behind her in the barracks, she could hear the other women settling in for the night. Some were talking quietly. Some were silent. But the quality of the silence had changed. They'd been fed, really fed, by people who had every reason to let them starve, by a system that valued rules over revenge. And tomorrow they'd be fed again, and the day after, and the day after that, until the routine of mercy became something they could almost trust, until the enemy became something they could almost understand. The night was warm. The ocean breathed in the distance. Somewhere in the darkness, a generator hummed, keeping the camp lit, keeping the protocols running, keeping the machine of civilization grinding forward, and even when civilization itself felt like a lie the war had exposed. But maybe that was the point. Maybe civilization was just the decision to keep following rules even when, especially when breaking them would be easier. Maybe mercy was just the choice to treat people fairly even when fairness wasn't efficient or emotionally satisfying or anything except difficult. Maybe that's what made it mercy. Keiko returned to her cot, lay down, stared at the canvas ceiling. Her stomach was full. Her heart was confused. Her identity was fractured into pieces she didn't know how to reassemble. But she was alive, and tomorrow there would be bacon. And somehow, impossibly, that felt like enough. 3 days later, the inspection came. Morning formation, standard procedure. But this time the British corporal who ran the daily checks had a new expression on his face. Something harder, more suspicious. All prisoners, he called out. Bring mattresses outside. Spot check for contraband. The words hit Keiko like cold water. Her second letter. The one she'd written after saving Yuki's life. The one she'd stopped hiding because she'd thought foolishly she now realized that maybe honesty was possible here. She'd been wrong. The women dragged their mattresses into morning light, lined them up in neat rows, stood at attention while guards worked methodically down the line, lifting corners, checking seams, searching for anything that prisoners shouldn't have. Keiko watched Morrison approach her cot. His face was carefully neutral, professional, but she saw the slight hesitation before his gloved hands found the paper she'd left on top of her folded blanket. He unfolded it. Read. His eyes moved to where she stood 20 feet away. She kept her gaze forward. Military bearing. Show nothing. But inside her heart was trying to break through her ribs. The letter was in English. The letter confessed everything. The letter said mercy was more difficult to bear than punishment because it forced you to see yourself through enemy eyes. The letter was evidence that she wasn't just a prisoner. She was something more complicated, something potentially dangerous. Morrison read it twice. Then he carefully refolded it and slipped it into his breast pocket, next to her first letter, next to his brother's dog tags, next to everything he was supposed to hate but somehow couldn't anymore. He moved to the next mattress. Keiko didn't breathe for 30 seconds. When the inspection ended, when the mattresses were returned to barracks, when the women dispersed to their various duties, Morrison caught her eye across the yard. He touched his breast pocket, once, deliberately. The message was clear. I'm keeping them, both of them. Your secrets are safe. But why, that evening she found out. Morrison left a note on her cot, folded the same way she folded hers, written on the same medical supply labels they both used because paper was scarce and secrets needed to hide in plain sight. I should report you. Prisoner with perfect English. Possible intelligence risk. Potential security threat. That's what the manual says. But the manual doesn't account for what happens when you watch someone cry over bacon, when you see them save an enemy's life, when their letters make more sense than anything your own side has told you. I'm not protecting you because I think you're innocent. I'm protecting you because I think innocence stopped mattering the moment we all became part of this machine. We're just trying to survive it with our humanity intact. That's harder than surviving the war itself. Keiko read it 3 times, then burned it in the small stove they use for heating water. Watched the paper curl and blacken and disappear. But she memorized every word first, because Morrison was right. The war hadn't ended. Not really. It had just transformed into a different kind of battle. The struggle to remember who you were before the machine tried to make you into something simpler, something easier to categorize, something that could be loved or hated without complication. They were both failing that battle, and somehow in that failure they were both winning something more important. The night deepened, the camp settled into its rhythms, generators hummed, guards changed shifts. In the medical tent, Dr. Carter worked late updating files on prisoners who'd arrived sick and were slowly healing under a systematic care that made no distinction between friend and enemy. In the mess tent, Texas was already prepping tomorrow's breakfast. More bacon, more eggs, more hash browns. The routine of abundance that said more about American power than any bombing campaign ever could. And in the barracks, Keiko lay awake thinking about letters and bacon and the strange mathematics of mercy. She was a prisoner. She was American. She was Japanese. She was a nurse. She was a woman. She was an enemy. She was a human being. All of these things were true simultaneously. The war had wanted her to be simple. The propaganda had demanded it. Choose a side. Choose an identity. Choose a truth that was clean and clear and easy to fight for. But truth wasn't clean, and identity wasn't simple. And mercy, it turned out, was the hardest choice of all, because mercy required you to see the enemy as human, to feed them when you could let them starve, to follow rules when revenge would be easier, to keep letters when reporting them would be safer. Mercy required you to be more than the war tried to make you, and that Keiko realized was exactly why it mattered. The bacon would come again tomorrow. The rules would continue. The protocols would march forward with mechanical inevitability. And somewhere in that grinding machinery of organized kindness, something almost like hope was starting to grow. Not hope for victory, the war was already over. Hope for something harder, the possibility that humans could choose to be decent even when decency wasn't easy, even when the other option was justified, even when hatred would feel better than the complicated weight of treating enemies like people who deserve breakfast. Keiko fell asleep thinking about bacon and woke up believing for the first time since surrender that maybe survival was worth the cost. The radio crackled at noon, August 15th, 1945. The sun hung directly overhead, bleaching color from the canvas tents, turning shadows into sharp-edged geometry. Heat rose from concrete in visible waves. Inside the command tent, officers gathered around a field radio that hissed and popped, with static from Tokyo from distance from the weight of history trying to squeeze itself through copper wire and electromagnetic waves. Then a voice, thin, formal, speaking Japanese with a particular cadence of imperial decree. Emperor Hirohito, the living god, the divine wind made flesh, admitting defeat, accepting the provisions set forth in the declaration issued by the heads of the governments, the United States, China, and Great Britain. The words continued, but Morrison stopped hearing them as language. They became pure sound, the frequency of surrender, the tone of an empire collapsing into its own gravity well. He stood near the tent entrance, close enough to hear, far enough to maintain the pretense that this wasn't the most important moment of his life. His hand moved unconsciously to his breast pocket, to the 2 letters he carried like contraband, like evidence of something the war hadn't prepared him to understand. Around him, officers removed their helmets. Some stood at attention, others simply sat down hard, their strings cut by invisible scissors. No one cheered. Victory was supposed to feel different than this, cleaner, more certain, less like the end of a story that had changed its meaning halfway through the telling. The broadcast ended, static returned. The radio operator switched it off. In the silence that followed, Morrison heard the ocean, heard generators, heard his own heartbeat loud in his ears. The war was over, which meant the rules would change, which meant the prisoners would go home, which meant Keiko would disappear back into whatever remained of Japan, and he would return to Iowa, and the strange alliance they'd built out of letters and bacon, and the systematic mercy of protocols neither of them had chosen would dissolve like smoke. He realized with the clarity of unwelcome revelation that this felt like loss. The British corporal appeared at his elbow. Prisoners need to be informed. Should we assemble them? Morrison nodded, couldn't trust his voice yet. They found the women in the usual places, laundry detail, medical tent, recreation area where they were allowed to sit in shade and pretend they had choices about how to spend their time. Formation, the corporal called. All prisoners, main yard, now. The women assembled with the automatic precision of people who'd been trained to obey before they'd been trained to think. 200 bodies falling into neat rows, faces carefully, blank eyes forward. Keiko stood in the second rank. Morrison could see her from his position near the platform where the corporal would make the announcement. She looked smaller than usual in her white uniform. Younger. Like the war had been aging her in reverse, stripping away the hard shell of military bearing to reveal something more fragile underneath. The corporal cleared his throat, spoke in English first, then waited while an interpreter translated to Japanese. As of 1200 hours local time, the Empire of Japan has accepted terms of unconditional surrender. The war in the Pacific is officially concluded. You will be repatriated to Japan as soon as transportation can be arranged. Medical clearances will be conducted over the next 2 weeks. You are no longer enemy combatants. You are displaced persons under the protection of the Geneva Convention until such time as you can be returned to your country of origin. The words fell into silence that felt like snow, cold, muffling, making everything distant and strange. No one moved, no one cried. They simply stood there, processing the information that the empire they'd served however reluctantly, however unwillingly, had just ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Keiko's face remained neutral, but Morrison saw her hands clench at her sides, saw the slight forward tilt of her body like she was about to collapse, but caught herself at the last second. He wanted to go to her, wanted to ask if she was okay, if she needed anything, if the sudden absence of war felt as disorienting to her as it did to him. But regulations existed for exactly these moments. When impulse tried to override procedure, when human feeling threatened to complicate the clean lines of military order. So he stayed where he was and watched her stand there alone, surrounded by 200 other women who were equally alone, all of them processing the news that they'd survived but had no clear idea what they'd survived into. The formation was dismissed. The women drifted apart like leaves released into still water. Some returned to barracks. Some sat in small groups, talking in voices too low to hear. Some simply stood in place, unable to move forward or back, frozen in the moment between one identity and whatever came next. Keiko walked toward the fence line, the same spot where they'd talked before, where secrets had been exchanged in the narrow space between duty and humanity. Morrison waited 5 minutes, professional distance, then followed. She stood facing west, toward the ocean, toward Japan, or maybe towards San Francisco, beyond it the city where she'd been born, the home that wasn't home anymore, the identity that war had fractured into pieces too complicated to reassemble. "You'll be going home soon," Morrison said. She didn't turn. Which home? The question hung between them like smoke. Morrison had no answer. What could he say? That home was wherever you were born. She'd been born in America. That home was wherever your parents came from. Her parents were dead, killed in bombing raids on Tokyo. That home was wherever you belonged. She belonged nowhere. The war had made sure of that. Instead, he pulled out her first letter, the one he'd found in her mattress 2 weeks ago, the one he'd carried every day since reading it so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. "This was yours," he said. "I kept it because it reminded me I hadn't forgotten how to be human. Thought you should have it back." Keiko turned, looked at the letter like it was evidence from a crime scene, something that would incriminate her if examined too closely. She took it with trembling hands. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because mercy isn't about deserving it. It's about remembering we're all human, especially when it's hard." He pulled out a second piece of paper, clean, no medical labels this time. Official stationery he'd requisitioned from supply. He'd written his address in careful block letters. Morrison Family Farm, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. "If you ever need anything." He handed it to her. "I don't know what happens next. Don't know if you'll go back to Japan or if you'll find a way to America or if we'll ever—" He stopped, started again. "But you should know that you're not nobody's enemy anymore. Not mine anyway." Keiko stared at the address, at the proof that he'd thought about her future, about a world where she might need help and he might be able to provide it. She folded it carefully, placed it in her uniform pocket next to the photograph of the Golden Gate Bridge and Morrison's previous letter and all the small pieces of evidence that she was more than what the war had tried to make her. "I don't know if I can go back to America," she said. "I was born there, but Executive Order 9066 made it clear that Japanese blood meant I wasn't really American. Not when it mattered. And Japan—" She paused. "Japan was never home. My parents forced me back, and then the military forced me into service, and now the empire that forced me is gone, and I don't know what's left." Morrison had no solution, no wisdom, just the dumb solidarity of someone who'd also been shaped by forces beyond his control and was trying to figure out how to be human in the aftermath. "My brother died at Guadalcanal," he said. "I joined up wanting to kill every Japanese person I could find. Wanted revenge so bad I could taste it. Then they assigned me to a POW camp, told me to follow protocols, handed me a manual about the Geneva Convention." He laughed without humor. "I was so angry. Felt like they were asking me to betray Tommy's memory by treating you people like you deserve breakfast. What changed? You did, all of you, when you cried over bacon. When you saved Yuki even though she tried to die. When you wrote letters that made more sense than anything my own side told me." He looked at her directly. "The war wanted you to be simple, an enemy I could hate cleanly, but you were complicated, human, and that was harder to deal with than hatred ever was. Keiko was quiet for a long moment. Then, thank you. For what? For being complicated too. They stood in silence while the camp continued its routines around them. Guards changing shifts, prisoners moving between duties, the machinery of organized mercy grinding forward, even though the war that had necessitated it was over. Finally, Morrison spoke again. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have said earlier. Keiko waited. I'm not a good person, Morrison said. I followed the rules because that's what I was ordered to do, not because I believed in them. Not at first, anyway. I treated you fairly because regulations said I had to, not because I wanted to. He paused. But somewhere along the way, the rules changed me, made me act like a decent person long enough that I started becoming one. And I think, he struggled for words, I think that's what protocols are for, to make us better than we naturally are, to force us to be human even when hatred feels easier. That's mercy, Keiko said softly, the systematic kind, the kind that works even when individual people fail. Morrison nodded. Your grandmother's kitchen, the one you remembered when you tasted bacon. Tell me about it. So she did. She told him about Saturday mornings in San Francisco, about the lace curtains and the radio playing Benny Goodman, about her grandmother who spoke no English but communicated perfectly through food, about feeling safe in a way that had nothing to do with borders or empires or the ideologies that would later tear everything apart. Morrison told her about Iowa, about Sunday breakfast after church, about his mother's kitchen that smelled like bacon and coffee and the casual abundance of American farming, about his brother Tommy who always tried to sneak extra strips before the blessing was said. They traded memories like currency, like proof that they'd both been human before the war tried to make them into something simpler. The sun moved lower. The shadows grew longer. The day bent toward evening. What happens now, Keiko asked. Now we follow procedure. Medical clearances, repatriation processing. You'll be on a ship to Japan within 3 weeks. Morrison's voice was carefully neutral. And I'll go back to Iowa, take over the farm, try to forget that war ever happened. Will you forget? He touched his breast pocket again. No, I don't think I will. Keiko smiled, small, sad, real. Me neither. They parted without shaking hands. Regulations. But something had been exchanged that was more binding than any formal agreement. Over the next 2 weeks, the camp transformed. The routines continued: breakfast, medical checks, laundry, but the purpose behind them had changed. They weren't maintaining prisoners anymore. They were preparing displaced persons for a return to a country that had been defeated so thoroughly it might not recognize them when they arrived. Dr. Carter worked long hours ensuring every woman was healthy enough for the voyage. She pulled Keiko aside one morning in the medical tent. You're a good nurse, Carter said. Better than good. You should be practicing medicine, not. She gestured at the camp, at the whole complicated aftermath of war. I don't know if I can, Keiko admitted. In Japan, I'm tainted by association with America. In America, I'm Japanese. Enemy, blood. Neither country wants me. Carter handed her a business card. Official, embossed, real. Walter Reed Hospital, Washington, D.C. That's where I'll be stationed after demobilization. She wrote something on the back. That's my personal address. If you ever make it back to America, and I think you should try, contact me. I have colleagues at UCSF. We can help. Keiko stared at the card like it was a passport to an impossible country. Why would you help me? Because the war's over, Carter said simply, and because spite is a terrible reason to waste a good nurse. You saved Yuki's life. That's all the recommendation I need. The departure day came gray and early. Trucks lined up outside the camp gates. The women assembled one final time, wearing the same white uniforms marked with black letters, carrying nothing except what they'd accumulated in captivity, which was almost nothing. Some had letters. Some had small gifts from guards who'd bent regulations in the final days. Photographs, spare socks, chocolate bars saved from rations. Keiko carried 2 letters from Morrison, his address, Carter's business card, and the photograph of the Golden Gate Bridge that had survived surrender and captivity and the systematic destruction of everything else. She stood in line waiting to board the trucks that would take them to the docks, to ships, to a Japan she didn't know how to belong to. Morrison appeared at the edge of the formation, not close enough to talk, just close enough to be seen. He lifted his helmet slightly, not a salute, not a wave, just an acknowledgement. She nodded back. Some things didn't need words. The trucks lurched forward. Dust rose behind the wheels, turning everything soft and indistinct. Through the slats of the truck's side panels, Keiko watched the camp shrink into distance. The laundry lines, the mess tent, the medical facility, the fence line where she and Morrison had traded secrets and memories, and the complicated currency of learning to be human again. All of it disappearing into dust. The ship that carried them from Manila Bay was a converted troop transport. Gray, functional, crowded with hundreds of displaced persons trying to figure out who they'd be in a world where war was over, but peace hadn't quite begun. Keiko stood at the railing watching the Philippine coastline recede. The wake stretched behind the ship like a scar on water. Beside her, Hana spoke softly. "Do you think we'll ever see them again, the Americans who were kind?" Keiko touched the papers in her pocket. Address, business card, letters that proved mercy could be mass-produced and still mean something. "I don't know," she said, "but I think that's not the point." "What is the point?" "The point is that it happened, that they could have let us starve and they fed us, that they could have treated us like animals and they followed rules instead. That mercy turned out to be stronger than hatred." She paused. "That matters, whether we see them again or not." The ship moved steadily west toward Japan, toward a country bombed into submission, its cities ash, its people starving, its empire dissolved into the kind of defeat that rewrites history. Keiko didn't know what was waiting there. Didn't know if she'd find family or work or any place to belong. Didn't know if she'd ever make it back to America, to San Francisco, to the grandmother's kitchen that existed now only in memory. But she knew something she hadn't known before captivity. She knew that mercy was real, that systems could be designed for fairness even when individuals preferred revenge, that bacon could trigger memories stronger than propaganda, that enemies could become something else if you fed them and clothed them and followed rules even when rules were harder than hatred. She knew that humanity survived war. Barely, imperfectly, but it survived. And that knowledge felt like enough to build a life on. The voyage took 3 weeks. The ship stopped at Okinawa at Yokohama, finally docking at what remained of Tokyo's harbor. Keiko disembarked into a city that looked like the end of the world. Buildings reduced to skeletons. Rubble stretching for miles. People with hollow eyes and hollower stomachs moving through ruins like ghosts who hadn't realized they were dead. The repatriation officials processed them with efficient compassion. Names, ages, origins, destinations if they had them, relief supplies if they didn't. Keiko listed her family address in Nagoya. Knew it was pointless, the city had been firebombed, but had no other answer to give. She received a ration card, a blanket, directions to a refugee center, and then she was released into what remained of Japan. She made her way to Nagoya over the course of 2 weeks. Trains ran sporadically, roads were damaged. The country was trying to remember how to be a country instead of an empire. Her family home was gone, just ash and twisted metal. Neighbors told her that her parents had died in the March bombings. Quick deaths, they said, trying to be kind, as if the speed of dying made it better. Keiko stood in the ruins and felt nothing. Grief required energy she didn't have. Instead, she returned to Tokyo, found work at a hospital that was overwhelmed with wounded, sick, and starving. The American occupation forces were setting up medical facilities, and they needed bilingual staff. She applied, got hired immediately. No one asked too many questions about her English, or where she'd learned it, or what she'd done during the war. They just needed nurses. She was a nurse. That was enough. She worked 16-hour days, treated American soldiers and Japanese civilians side by side, watched as the systems she'd first encountered in Manila, the protocols, the regulations, the organized mercy were applied to an entire nation. Food distribution centers, medical clinics, school reconstruction, democratic reforms. The machinery of occupation that looked less like conquest and more like a massive systematic attempt to rebuild what war had destroyed. It was the bacon breakfast scaled up to national proportions. And it worked. Not perfectly, not without resentment, but it worked. Japan began to heal. Slowly, painfully. but measurably. And Keiko kept the letters. She married in 1952 a doctor named Hiroshi Tanaka who'd served in China and carried his own complicated relationship with the war. They didn't talk about it much, just built a life in the spaces between memory. Daughter Yumi was born in 1955. Keiko taught her English, taught her that identity could be more than one thing, taught her that mercy was possible even between enemies. Hiroshi died in 1968. Heart attack, sudden. Keiko buried him and kept working and raised Yumi alone. Granddaughter Naomi was born in 1985. Bright, curious, fluent in both English and Japanese. The bridge between worlds that Keiko had tried to be. Keiko retired in 2000, moved into a small apartment in Tokyo, lived quietly. The letters stayed hidden in the lining of her old coat, a secret she never told anyone. Not Hiroshi, not Yumi, not even Naomi. Some memories were too private, too precious, too complicated to explain to people who hadn't lived through the moment when enemy became human and mercy became real. She died in her sleep in 2008, 88 years old, peacefully, the old coat still draped over a chair. Naomi found the letters while sorting belongings for donation. Read them, wept, began to research. She found records at the National Archives in Washington, found Morrison's name on guard rosters, found Keiko's name on prisoner lists, found Dr. Carter's reports documenting medical treatment that exceeded requirements by any reasonable standard. She found Morrison's obituary, died in 2003, Iowa. Survived by son James, daughter Margaret, 5 grandchildren. She called the number listed. James Morrison answered, older now, voice carrying the same Iowa accent his father must have had. My grandmother was Keiko Yamada, Naomi explained. She was a prisoner at Manila. Your father was a guard there. Silence on the line. Then, wait, he kept a letter in Japanese, had it translated, kept it in his desk his whole life, said it was important but never explained why. They talked for an hour, comparing stories, piecing together what their grandparents had been too private to explain. The letters existed, both of them. Keiko's original and Morrison's translation carefully written on the back in his precise handwriting. Proof that the conversation had been real, that mercy had happened, that enemies had learned to be human again through the systematic application of fairness, even when fairness wasn't easy. Naomi contacted the National World War II Museum, donated both letters. Both. Explained the context. The museum created an exhibit, 2 letters under glass, preserved, protected, lit by soft lights that made the aging paper look almost sacred. Keiko's handwriting on one side, Morrison's translation on the other. A conversation between enemies who discovered they were human. The plaque read simply, "Mercy outlasts victory." The exhibit opened in 2010. Naomi flew from Tokyo. James Morrison drove from Iowa. They met for the first time in front of the display that documented a moment neither of them had witnessed, but both of them had inherited. Keiko Yamada was your grandmother, James said. Statement, not question. David Morrison was your father. They shook hands, strangers connected by letters and bacon, and the systematic mercy of protocols that had kept 2 people human when war wanted them to be simple. Did she ever talk about it? James asked. Never. I only found the letters after she died. Same. Dad kept that letter in his desk. Said once that mercy was the hardest thing he ever had to learn. Didn't understand until now. They stood together, reading words written 65 years ago by people trying to make sense of a war that had stopped making sense. Around them, the museum filled with visitors. Veterans, students, families trying to understand how people who'd been trained to hate had learned to see each other's humanity. Naomi read her grandmother's words aloud, softly, like prayer. We were taught that surrender erased honor, but here I see men who have more honor than those who taught me. James read his father's response. Rules made me treat you like a human being long enough to remember that's what you are. They stood in silence for a long time. Finally, Naomi spoke. They never saw each other again, did they? No, the war ended. She went back to Japan. He went back to Iowa. James paused. But they kept the letters. Both of them. Carried them for decades. Why? Because some things are too important to forget. The museum stayed open late that night. Visitors came and went. The letters remained under glass, preserved against time, against forgetting, against the natural human tendency to simplify history into clean narratives about good and evil. The truth was more complicated. The truth was bacon triggering memories of San Francisco kitchens. The truth was a soldier carrying his dead brother's dog tags and trying to hate an enemy who cried over breakfast. The truth was systematic mercy that worked not because people were good, but because rules forced them to act better than they felt. The truth was that humanity survived war by the thinnest margin, by protocols and regulations and the stubborn insistence that enemies deserved clean towels and warm water, and bacon even when revenge would be easier. The truth was complicated, and the truth mattered, because mercy outlasted victory. Because the letters survived when the war didn't. Because two families met 65 years later in front of a museum display and recognized that their grandparents had been more than the war tried to make them. They'd been human, and they'd remembered it even when remembering was the hardest thing in the world. The lights dimmed, the museum prepared to close. Naomi and James exchanged contact information, promised to stay in touch, walked out together into a Washington evening that was warm and ordinary and peaceful in ways their grandparents had fought to make possible. Behind them, the letters remained. Evidence, testimony, proof that mercy was real, that systems could be designed for fairness, that bacon could mean more than breakfast, that enemies could become human if you treated them fairly long enough. That war destroyed almost everything, but not quite everything. Some things survived, letters, memories. The stubborn insistence that people deserved dignity even when dignity wasn't deserved. Some things outlasted victory itself, and those were the things worth remembering, worth preserving, worth passing down to children who would never know war but needed to understand what their grandparents had learned in its aftermath. That mercy wasn't weakness. It was the hardest form of strength because it required seeing enemies as human even when everything said not to, especially then. The museum closed, the lights went dark, but the letters remained, waiting for tomorrow's visitors, ready to tell their story again, and again, and again, for as long as anyone needed to remember that humanity survived by the thinnest margin, and that margin was called mercy.